The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Alzheimer's Learning Day webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lakelyn Hogan, and I am Gerontologist and Caregiver Advocate for Home Instead Senior Care, and I will be our facilitator for today's Alzheimer's Learning Day webinar, specifically for family caregivers. Alzheimer's Learning Day is brought to you by Home Instead Senior Care, a network of locally owned franchise offices. Home Instead Senior Care's network offers in-home care with an individualized approach to keeping your loved one safe and independent at home. To learn more, you can visit homeinstead.com. And before we begin, I just wanted to cover a few quick housekeeping items. First and foremost, our lines are all muted, so feel free to go about your day. If you're at home and the doorbell rings or the dog barks, don't worry about it. We can't hear you on our end. And then also, we welcome questions throughout today's webinar. There is a questions box there on your screen, and feel free to type in questions at any time. There's no such thing as a silly question, and we will leave the last 15 minutes or so for questions at the end, but feel free to type in your questions at any time the minute they come to you, because we're keeping them all in a queue and we'll address them at the end. And then also, we are recording today's webinar and we will send you a link afterwards. So don't worry about having to take notes, or if you really like the content that we cover today and want to send it on to a family member or friend, coworker, we'll have that link available and send it out to you via email. And it'll also be posted on our Alzheimer's Learning Day site, so you can access it there again at a later date. So that goes over our housekeeping items for today. So let's go ahead and get started and talk more about this crash course to caring for your loved one with dementia. Almost half of caregivers do not have a choice in becoming a caregiver. It's a situation you find yourself in that you may not be prepared for. So it's important to approach it with an attitude of learning. Learning as much as you can about the disease itself, how to plan ahead, care options, ways to minimize behavioral symptoms, and how to take care of yourself. Today, we're joined by two experts to discuss approaches, solutions, and resources for some of the most common questions, or the I don't know how to deal with this type of challenges that you might face when caring for your loved one with Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. Our first guest expert is Dr. Janet Fast. She is a professor in the Department of Human Ecology at the University of Alberta. She holds a doctorate in family and consumer economics from Cornell University. Throughout her career, Dr. Fast has engaged in research and policy and practice with a focus on economics of aging and the paid work and unpaid care work of family caregivers. Her research addresses family, labor, health, and continuing care policy issues, and she is often called on to consult with or advise government policymakers and NGOs on policies related to caregiving and workplace supports. She's part of an international and multidisciplinary research team investigating the intersection of work and care across the life course. More recently, she's become a member of the leadership team for AgeWell National Centers of Excellence program, focused on assistive technologies that support health and well-being for older adults and their family caregivers, particularly those who are juggling dual responsibilities of paid work and care work. She also draws on personal experience caregiving for her father with dementia while working at a more than full-time academic job. And our second guest presenter is Janine Karlsen, a Home Instead Senior Care franchise owner. Jeannie has worked in the healthcare world for her entire 25-year career. She's a registered nurse and has a master's in counseling, and her work has taken her from the bedside to clinical management and now co-owning the Vancouver Home Instead Senior Care office. She loves that this business brings together all of her passions, including planning care for individuals, creating partnerships within the community, and building a thriving business that gives back. So I want to thank you both, Janet and Janine, for joining us today and for being our experts for today's live webinar. So thank you both and welcome.
Thanks, it's good to be here.
Well, it's great to have you both here. And if you're both ready, we're going to kick off our first topic. And that topic is the impact of family and spousal relationships. So we're going to cover a few different topics throughout today's webinar, and then we will open it up for Q&A at the end. So again, feel free to type in your questions at any time. And our first topic is going to focus on the impact of caregiving on family and spousal relationships. And first of all, we know that dementia impacts more than just the affected individual. It can have an impact on everyone in the family. And it can strain relationships between siblings as they adjust to the new family dynamic, especially when they have to accept different care responsibilities for mom or dad. Or it can change the dynamic of a marital relationship if you're caring for a spouse with dementia. So I'm going to pose the question out there. What tips do you have for family caregivers who might be dealing with these types of challenges? And Janet, if it's okay, would you mind kicking off this topic by sharing maybe a little research and background about these different relationships and how dementia can impact those relationships?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. I think a good place to start is just an observation that this is a fairly common experience for Canadians. There are more than, in 2012, according to national survey data, there were more than 8 million caregivers in Canada, and 500,000 of those were caring for someone with a dementia. And those same data tell us that there are a number of different consequences that caregivers report as a result of taking on care responsibilities, and certainly social consequences, including relationships with family members, are among those consequences. Some of the consequences that have been identified include not having enough time to spend with various family members, as well as with friends and others that are important members of our social networks. And what's, I think, important to understand is that people who are providing dementia care, caring for a loved one with dementia, are much more likely to experience those consequences than are those caring for people with physical disabilities, for example. So it's much more common for dementia care providers to say that they don't have enough time to spend with their partner. The quality of the relationship with their partner, especially if that person is the person they're caring for, is changed radically, and as are relationships with children and other family members. And one of the results is that caregivers, and in particular dementia caregivers, report feeling very isolated and lonely. And we know that that has serious implications for their own health and well-being.
Those are some very interesting statistics. Gosh, over 500,000 people in Canada are caring specifically for someone with dementia. That is a very large number. So I commend everyone on the line for jumping on to learn more about this, because there's likely somebody in your community that you will know that's caring for someone with dementia or Alzheimer's. So wow, those are some staggering statistics and some interesting information on how it affects the different relationships in people's lives. Janine, I was going to ask you, are you aware of any resources out there that can help these families navigate these different relationships, or any personal stories from clients you've worked with where you've seen this in action?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about a client of ours who his daughter had decided that she really wanted to bring him home to live with her. And in order to do that, of course, she was living in a large enough house to do it with her husband and 1 or 2 grown children during the time that her dad was living with her. And that was, you could see from the outside, as we were putting in care and working with her to see what would she need to do. She was also a leader in the community, with a really interesting practice and consulting with companies all over the world. So she had a busy job. She worked out of her home. but she still needed support so that she could focus on her work, and her dad could never be left alone. And so as we watched the family navigate this, you could see that they needed to have conversations. And, you know, I don't know personally how often they had those conversations, but she needed to talk to her husband and her kids to find out how they would be able to help. And so in some cases, if she needed to be out of town, our caregivers and her husband would then sort of take turns and do shifts in taking care of the father. And it worked very well, but the load that you could see for the entire family was pretty high in being able to navigate it and trying to always be respectful of each other. You could see they were being very careful, and especially the daughter of our client was looking to make sure that she wasn't putting too much load on the other people when it was her dad that they were doing this for. So you could see that navigation happening. And I think overall they managed very, very well for probably a good year when he needed 24-hour observation and support all the time.
Wow, that's a neat example of how families are working together to provide that needed care. And I've been working with families with very similar issues over the years, and I like how you said that in that family's situation, they kind of split up the care. And a lot of times when I see adult children caring for an aging parent, they take on the duties that fit their strengths. So maybe the son works in finance, so he kind of takes over all of the financial bill paying and those types of responsibilities. And perhaps the daughter that lives nearby takes on more of the hands-on care, and another daughter orders groceries online and has them sent to the house, or whatever, helps with the grocery shopping and errand running, or taking the child with a medical background takes them to all the doctor's appointments. So it's neat to see how families come together around this issue of caregiving and kind of help to divvy up those different responsibilities. And I know Home Instead has a great resource. It's called the 50-50 rule. It's on caregiverstress.com. We'll have some resources for you later on in the presentation, so you don't have to write this down. But it goes over conversation starters with your siblings on how you can split up that care and contribute to the caregiving experience within the family. Janet, do you have any other resources or any examples from your professional experience in these different relationships that you think it would be beneficial for families to know? Need tips?
I think another important thing to understand that we've found in our research is that it doesn't actually matter how big the family network or the social network is. It often comes down to one or two people carrying the primary responsibility for care. So even in large families, often it's one or two people who end up doing most of the hands-on care tasks. And that can really strain relationships within families, as you say, between siblings, for example, where there are multiple siblings, but one of them ends up being the one. And so having that conversation with your siblings is really important, and with other family members as well. If you can spread the load, it will at least ease some of the burden for those who are doing the lion's share of the care. And just knowing that other family members are there, even if as backup. If the caregiver or the primary caregiver, the person who's carrying most of the load, has a bad day or is ill, or has to go off and deal with something in their own life, somebody else is there that can step in. It becomes a real problem, though, with Canadians being as geographically mobile as they are. It's also often the case that family members are not living near each other anymore, and that can reduce the options in terms of who's available to care. And so family members also need to think about, as you said, what would be most suitable for me if I'm 3 provinces away. What can I do to help my sister or my grandchild who is closer geographically to this person and just as a simple function of that, ends up being the main hands-on carer.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of great points there. Yeah, Janine, do you have anything to add to that?
I was going to say, Janet, I think that's a really good point, because we see that every day, where often we'll get a call from a family member who lives in Ontario, which is the other side of the country, and they will just say outright, you know, my brother's there and he's doing a lot of hands-on stuff, and so I've said that I'm going to do the research. I'm going to find out about these 4 things and then report it back to the family next time we talk. So we see that quite a lot. And I think it's important to realize that people still can be really helpful, and I'll encourage people when I speak to them on the phone to say there's still a lot you can do from far away because of the tracking down resources. Making appointments can even be done from far away. Managing some of the appointment running around, doctors, things, checkups, that kind of stuff can be done by some of the family members that aren't close by, because they can do that by telephone. So yeah, I've seen that work very well.
And could I just add that some of the work that Lakelyn mentioned that I'm doing right now in understanding how to engage technology in easing the burden of care, there are a lot of technologies evolving now that will allow someone to monitor what's going on with the person being cared for, even from a distance. So even the caregiver who is doing the primary hands-on care can go to work and can monitor what's going on with the person they're caring for from their desktop. Or it might be somebody who's living in another province and could help to support that person and the main caregiver by doing some of that more remote monitoring, or, as you say, communications with physicians and others that need to be engaged in the care, with other family members. There are some really neat apps now for tablets and smartphones that will support networking of family members and friends and neighbors, and even formal carers, in order to kind of manage the care that's being delivered and coordinate the care that's being delivered by multiple people, and monitor medications and all kinds of things that can now be done remotely. And therefore, people who are not living next door or in the same residence as the person being cared for, they can now more easily contribute to the care.
That's fantastic that those different types of technologies are making caregiving, or changing the landscape for families that are caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's and dementia. And I know we talked a lot about so far how usually the care falls to maybe 1 or 2 primary caregivers or carers that are maybe more localized to the older adult. Maybe they're living with them or living nearby, and the family, again, is very involved in the care. One thing I get asked a lot about, and maybe you both find the same, is when it comes to the everyday, the day-to-day of caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease or other dementia, people often struggle with different activities and ways to keep their loved ones engaged. So I'm going to kind of segue us into the next topic that we wanted to tackle in today's webinar is, how can we keep someone engaged, and how can we create meaningful activities? So one challenge we hear frequently is finding different ways to keep someone's loved one occupied or engaged in meaningful activities, especially when the activities or hobbies they used to enjoy now have become more frustrating or a struggle due to their declining cognitive abilities. So the next question to both of you is, what suggestions do you have to keep someone with dementia engaged in meaningful activities? And Janine, I thought I might let you kick off this one. Do you have any approaches or suggestions, any stories of clients that you've worked with where you've created some different meaningful activities?
Yeah, thank you, Lakelyn. I think one of the things that we've seen for family members or for outside caregivers, whoever's going to be working with the client in the day and just trying to pass the time, is to really connect with that person. And sometimes in a family, we can hear the same stories over and over again. You've heard about Dad's job when he was in his 40s and what he was doing, and you hear it over and over and over again. And sometimes we can become a little bit, less sensitive to it. But those are clues for places where you can connect with them, where you can connect with their expertise. If you're talking to somebody and you know that they were incredibly proud of a certain time in their life, what they did, dig into that. And maybe you've heard those things before, but to allow them to open up, there's a chance that you're going to hear something from an angle that you never really heard before because you're asking the questions. And those are things that, in that case, they can still relate to. They can still recount to you and tell you about that time when they were able to take on the world, when they were feeling competent, because often that's one of the things that they can lose in this stage, is that feeling of competence and purpose. So bringing that back to them is often a place where you can connect easily. And then we've looked at, if you know that your dad loved golfing, but he can't golf anymore, maybe it's just going to the golf club for lunch, or a local city golf course, or to a driving range and watching different people hitting the ball and talking to him about, the swing and what does he think of that one. So really finding some way to still engage in those fun activities or the things that gave them a lot of joy at the level that they're able to in this moment.
Those are some great examples, Janine. I like the golfing example. That sounds like a great way to keep them engaged in those different activities, meaningful activities. Janet, are you finding anything through your research on different interventions or approaches that families can take when engaging in their loved one in different activities?
This is not something that I do research on myself, but we have talked with a lot of caregivers and of course with a number of the people that they're caring for. And I think the key that you already mentioned, Lakelyn, is that it needs to be activity that is meaningful to the person. Just as a personal anecdote, my dad was in long-term care for a couple of years before he passed, and he had been a lifelong newspaper reader. He devoured newspapers whenever he could get his hands on one. But he really kind of lost the ability to read and comprehend for himself. But one of the things that they did in his long-term care facility was they would gather residents who were interested for an hour or so in the morning and read articles from the newspaper together and discuss them among those who were able to. And that was something that was meaningful to him, that he enjoyed, and that did really engage his mind. And of course, that's important in maintaining what cognitive function is left to the person. But bringing a musician in and playing music or something like that, probably not. That was not meaningful to him, and forcing him to participate was probably not at all helpful. So I think the key really is finding activities that are going to that the person is going to be able to relate to and has some meaning in their history and their current lives. And again, if I can make reference to some of the work that we're doing with technologies, a lot of the new technologies that are being developed are ones that are that can socially engage the person with dementia. And so there are a number of these kinds of technologies being developed, including things like digital storytelling software, and that can be used as a kind of an organized activity in a care setting, or with an individual and a family member. And this is something that people with dementia often still can engage in, and it allows them to tap their long-term memories and tell stories about their earlier lives, and create something that is both creative and meaningful, not just to them, but perhaps to their family members as well, that can be a lifelong memory of that person's life for family members going forward.
Those are some great suggestions. That's a very interesting way to utilize technology, is to engage them socially. I like that a lot. I've also just seen through different trade shows and conferences lots of different technologies that are focused on that too. So that's interesting that you're diving into that in your research, Janet. And another thing that I often talk with caregivers about is that activities, sometimes people think, well, if it's an activity, it needs to be like a craft or an outing or something very specific, or I have to put a lot of thought and effort into it. And sometimes engaging in activities could be simple things like if a female used to always do the laundry in her house, involving that individual in folding the laundry. It can still be an engaging, meaningful activity, something that they used to do, allows them to still contribute to the household, or engage them in cooking, have them help stir while you're making dinner, something of that sort. So those are also meaningful activities. And I think sometimes families can lose sight of, when you say the word activities, they think it has to be something elaborate. But it could be something very simple that you're already doing as a caregiver that you can just involve, or care provider, as you can involve the individual in those different activities. So all great suggestions, and a great topic, and one we get asked about a lot. So thank you both for your insight. And I know that Home Insight just has a couple resources that can help families in this arena. There's a daily companion app that can be downloaded that has tools and resources, tips on different activities right at your fingertips. And you can download that at helpforalzheimersfamilies.ca. And we'll again share all those resources with you at the end of the hour. And then there's some online e-learning courses for family caregivers that can learn about different strategies for engagement. Because sometimes, especially in the mid to later stages of Alzheimer's or dementia, it can be sometimes more challenging if somebody becomes agitated to engage them in activities. So just some tips and resources on helpforalzheimersfamilies.ca for family caregivers there. So we have another topic that we wanted to cover, and that is focused on the caregiver. We've been talking a lot about how can caregivers better care for their loved one with dementias, but it's really important for these care providers or the family caregivers to be taking care of themselves. So caregiving can impact all aspects of life, emotional, financial, can impact our workplace, our personal health, our well-being, our emotions can get wrapped up in this. So my question is, what do caregivers need to sustain themselves and stay healthy? I know it's a lot of different topics kind of all rolled into one, but Janet, would you mind kicking off this topic surrounding how family caregivers can continue to take care of themselves so that they can care for their loved ones?
Sure. Again, starting with, what sorts of challenges do caregivers face? And referring back to the national survey data on the consequences of caregiving, I mentioned that social consequences, relationships with family members, not having enough time to spend with family members, which about 60% of dementia care providers report as being a problem. In addition to those social consequences, there also are financial consequences, and including consequences for employment, as well as health consequences. And all of those consequences are much more likely to be experienced by dementia care providers than other care providers. So, as many as 70% of all dementia care providers say that they worry because of their care responsibilities, that they're fatigued. About 60% are fatigued by their care responsibilities. Many of them report that their sleep is disturbed. Many report that they're depressed. About 30% of dementia care providers report that they're depressed. And that, of course, affects overall physical and mental health of caregivers. We know that financial worries can also be a problem, that many caregivers end up either having to miss days of work or reduce their hours of work or even quit a job entirely. And they not only lose the income and the benefits that might come with those jobs, but jobs for caregivers often end up being respite. It's their opportunity to get out, to do something other than providing care, even though they're very happy to, and they're very committed to caring well for their loved ones. They need a break. They need to get away, and often paid work, can be that escape. And they may just have to continue to work in order to make ends meet. They've got to cover their own expenses, their family's expenses, and often additional expenses that they have to shell out for the person that they're caring for, which might be anything from home renovations so that they can stay in a home in the community. It might be additional or different clothing or furnishings or mobility aids or incontinence supplies, or many different things, and also formal care services, home care or residential care. So being able to maintain employment, being able to remain financially sound is also a big part of the equation. There are various strategies to address each of those health and social and financial consequences. And I can elaborate if you want, but we can give Janine an opportunity to chime in here as well.
Yeah, if we have some more time, I'd love to dive more into that. But yeah, Janine, I'll shift over to you. Any thoughts or suggestions on, caregivers are going through all these different emotions. Is this normal? Is this something that a lot of other caregivers are feeling? When might it be a sign that, the caregiver is overwhelmed to a point where they do need some help or assistance? Any thoughts on those areas?
Yeah, you know what, it's very interesting because we see it, especially as we're working with families. The first time we talk with somebody, and almost anybody that you say to them, wow, that sounds really tough, that you're juggling a lot, you know that this is already probably past the time that they needed to get some help, because they'll break down right away. They break down because somebody's actually focusing on them, and not because they don't want to be doing it, just that they're carrying such a huge load. And in some of those cases, I've seen two different approaches really be helpful. The idea of people being able to access a group of other caregivers for people with dementia or other things, but even having it specifically be around dementia, a support group for family caregivers, friends caregivers, it's super helpful. They're able to actually talk to people and listen to somebody else and think, oh my gosh, I'm not all alone in this. That person, that's exactly what I've been thinking. They can brainstorm, and they can be helped and guided to be able to let some of those feelings out, some of the things that they might not even feel like are okay to express. They might have anger, they might be just grief struck, and where can they express that? In many cases, they don't have a place, or they feel like they can't. So having a place where they hear other people, that's really helpful. In BC, we have a group called the Family Caregivers of British Columbia. They have some fantastic programs, and I imagine that every province probably has something like that. So that group actually has in-person groups. They have online groups. So if you live in different parts of the province, you can still tap into it. And so as a group, that's really helpful. But then what we've also used is a specific dementia consultant who's also a psychologist. And she has worked with family members, one-on-one, the family members, in helping them navigate. They might be navigating some of the stuff we talked about earlier with the family. They may be navigating roles and responsibilities. They may be just navigating, how do you work through your feelings? Maybe you didn't really get along with your mother or father beforehand. Maybe you didn't even have that much to do with them, but all of a sudden you're there and you're the person that has to do everything, and you're angry. how do you work through some of the previous stuff to clear the way for being able to be present with them today? So those are some things that I've seen be very, very helpful depending on the situation.
Those are great suggestions. And I know that many, or oftentimes, care providers, family caregivers are also, like Janet mentioned, working full-time, or maybe they're having to make workplace accommodations because of their caregiving roles. Are there any resources, or is there any legislation in Canada that helps working caregivers, or any tips or advice for these caregivers that are juggling these multiple roles, one being employee and caregiver to a loved one? Janet, any thoughts on that, or do you have any resources?
Yeah, I think there are two primary types of policies that can provide some protection and therefore some assistance to caregivers who are trying to maintain employment alongside their care responsibilities. The workplace itself, employers often will provide some assistance, obviously some more than others, and there's a lot of variability across workplaces, but in particular in workplaces where retention of good employees is important, employers often will have explicit or implicit accommodations for caregivers with, for employees with caring responsibilities. It's somewhat less common than, for example, employees with childcare responsibilities, but it's becoming, it's moving up on the radar screen of employers. They're now recognizing that their employees do have, often have care responsibilities alongside their work responsibilities. Caregivers now comprise 30% of the workforce. So 30% of all employees out there also have care responsibilities. So they better start paying some attention, and many of them are. So they'll offer various kinds of supports and accommodations. They will allow an employee to work part-time or take short leaves, or sometimes provide referrals to service providers. Some, a very rare few, even provide on-site what would be kind of the equivalent of daycare. So adult daycare facilities and services right on site, or subsidies for acquiring those services and referrals to service providers. So many employers are now beginning to offer those kinds of supports and accommodations. There's a wide range of those sorts of things. Those you need to really go to your employer and find out. One of the things that we have discovered in our research, though, is that employees, caregivers, are often reluctant to disclose their status as a caregiver because they're afraid that they'll be discriminated against in the workplace. Fortunately, we have, as part of our human rights legislation, we have a prohibition against discriminating against employees because of family status. And some of the recent case law is interpreting family status to include care responsibilities, family care responsibilities. So your employer actually can't fire you because you're a caregiver. But one of the other things that we discovered, which is kind of counterintuitive, is that employers are telling us that they need their employees to disclose that they have these care responsibilities, and that it has the potential, at least, to interfere with their employment, their jobs, because they can't do anything if they don't know. And many are willing to try to work it out, and in fact now by law they are required to try to work it out. So I think it's really important for employees who also have care responsibilities to make sure that their employer does know and that they understand what supports their employer might provide in helping them to juggle their paid work and care work. Other government policies exist that in the event that they can't maintain full-time employment and or have care-related expenses that are creating financial hardship for them, there are other government programs that provide a financial assistance. One province, Nova Scotia, has a care benefit. Other provinces have care schemes that will allow where they pay the benefit to the care receiver, and then the care receiver can, in some instances, pay their family member to provide the care. And there are a number of caregiver tax credits that can be claimed that reduce your tax payable and so, you know, help out a little bit financially. Information about all of those things is available on relevant government websites, and the Human Rights Commission actually has a really nice guide for employers and employees who have care responsibilities and are trying to balance those with their paid work.
Wow, that's a lot of great information for those employed family caregivers. And Homan said also recently we find that daughters are more often taking on the caregiving role than sons. So we created a Daughters in the Workplace program. You can find out more at daughtersintheworkplace.ca. But there's some great conversation starters on there for employees on how they can approach their employer. Because as you mentioned, Janet, sometimes they're reluctant. I've heard some family caregivers say, well, when it's my child that's sick, that child is mine, so I feel like it's okay to talk about that in the workplace, but my parents' healthcare issues, I don't feel as comfortable sharing with my coworker. So that might be a little bit of one of the barriers there. But anyway, there's some more great conversation starters on daughtersintheworkplace.ca. Again, we'll share all those great resources at the end. But thank you, Janet, for sharing those resources. And it sounds like there's a lot of other resources, and we'll send out the links that Janet mentioned in the follow-up email so that you don't have to feel like you have to write them down feverishly. But before we move to questions, which again, if you have a question, please feel free to type it in. We're going to get to Q&A in just a few minutes here. But I wanted to ask one more question. I wanted to talk about care options. So what should families consider if they're exploring different care options? We've talked about at some point throughout today's webinar the importance of respite care and bringing in outside help when a caregiver is feeling overwhelmed, or perhaps while they go to work, making sure that their loved one is safe at home or safe in a adult day program, something of that sort. So Janine, would you mind talking a little bit about the different care options and what families should consider when they're looking at different options for care?
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting because just this past weekend, I had a great chat with a couple, and they were only 69 years old, but they were already having really informed, open discussions about what they want to have happen. They had one child, but they did not want to have that child have to do all the work in taking care of them. So they were actively exploring every option and getting a really good understanding of it. And that is the first recommendation I would make, is to find out, how does it work in your province where you live? What are the choices you have? Are you going to need to access simply, or not simply, but only looking at publicly funded places? Do you have financial ability to maybe do something that could be a combination? Do you want to stay in your home until you're ready to leave it? How long would that be? In this case, the couple was talking about the fact that the wife thought that she would really like to move to a community much sooner, and the husband was adamant that he wanted to stay at home. But what I admired was that they were having the conversation very openly and very intentionally about what they were going to do. So that's probably the absolute first thing that you want to be doing. But then also for family members, because perhaps you're the family caregiver for somebody who has dementia, and that person hasn't really made a plan. They haven't looked at it, and now you're left with making these decisions. We had a client who we were contacted by his family. He had a very close extended family. He had never married and he had no children. And he also had an incredibly close friend group. He was an extremely talented professional his whole life, very well known in the community, very influential, lived in a great apartment in a very central area of town. We could get to all sorts of things. But when he got the diagnosis of dementia, the family didn't know what was possible, and they panicked and moved to a place where immediately they were looking to move him into a community as fast as possible. They brought our caregivers in to kind of bridge the gap. But what they found was that once there was a little bit more structure to his day and somebody that was popping in there on a frequent basis, and then the family took care of some days and they would be there, he really settled into a routine and was doing very, very well at home. And so now it's been almost a year, and they've realized that they can keep him home for much longer than they had originally understood. But that was because they got more information. They started looking into it. They talked to communities. The people in the communities also let them know to figure out what he wanted and would that be possible. So I think that whole idea of looking at the options, what would the person that you're looking after want, and is it possible for us to get the closest solution to that? That's really what I've seen over and over again that's worked the best.
Those are all wonderful suggestions. Thank you so much, Janine. And I know that on that same help for Alzheimer's Families.ca, there is also a Hilarity for Charity grant program, a dementia relief grant that families can apply for. You had mentioned sometimes it takes a combination of public programs and privately paid for assistance and family, kind of a combination of all those things. And respite care grants can be another care option for families too. So visit that site for more information. And it looks like we have covered all the topics for the most part. And so I wanted to open it up for questions. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to write them in. And we do have some good ones coming in. So I wanted to cover the first one. This individual wrote in and said, my father has advanced dementia but wants to continue living at home by himself. I'm concerned that he is at risk of wandering away and getting lost. How could we ensure that he can be located when he often forgets to take his cell phone with him? And Janine, I might turn to you first, because you had just talked about a situation where you have a client who wanted to stay at home and the family worked together with your organization to help keep him there. Do you see wandering risk a lot in the different individuals that you work with that have dementia? And what are some solutions out there? Or are there any, well, maybe afterwards we'll go to Janet. Maybe she has some technology suggestions. But Janine, we'll look to you first for some suggestions for this family.
Yeah, and I'm excited to hear from Janet too, hoping that she's got some good technology stuff that's coming forward for us. But we do have, not the same client, but another fellow, similar situation, no family himself, some friends that help with his financial decisions and stuff now that he has dementia. And he does walk. He has got a history of, he doesn't wander so much as he has a clear intention and he knows where he's going, but somewhere along the way, he loses his way and isn't sure, and it takes him a while to come back. And so with him, we've really been going through a number of different possibilities. And he's adamant, and most of the time is able to be safe on his own, but he's also adamant that for his quality of life, he does not want somebody there all the time monitoring him. He wants to have independence. So there's this balance as well in trying to allow him to have freedom, understanding that there's a level of risk that he still has a right to choose. So what can we put around him to help him be as safe as possible, but allowing him some autonomy? So one of the things we've done is we have it's not every day, but every other day, one of our caregivers is in there checking in with him to see how is he functioning. Generally in the past, we've seen that something's going on and he starts to get more and more confused over time. And being in there every other day is helpful. We can start to monitor that so that we can raise an alert. He has friends that live very close by, and they're committed to checking in on him every day. He's not somebody that we could put a wristband or a GPS sort of technology on. He probably would get angry and take it off, or forget and not put it on if he did take it off. So it is a challenge for someone like him. And I would love to know if, Janet, you have some ideas, especially around allowing somebody to be able to still make some choices for how they live and where they live, and how we can maybe keep them safer or find them quickly. And I believe also Home Instead has a website where you can put the details of the person that you're concerned about on. You can load all of your connections on there so that it's already, if they went missing, you can just hit send, basically. It'll send an immediate message out to everybody you've put on that website, so that you can also have people looking for your person really quickly that are all within the area. And that's a really valuable resource to have set up. And if you have any worries about this.
Yeah, that is the missingseniornetwork.ca is that website. And there's a whole, on caregiverstress.com, there's a whole section on prevent wandering that I would definitely encourage families to check out. It's a great resource. But Janet, any technologies out there that you're aware of?
Yeah, this is an area where the technology is already pretty good, and it is getting better and better by the day. There's huge advances being made on monitoring technologies, and it doesn't remove that touchy issue of the balancing of safety and autonomy that comes with any kind of decision making about that's especially prominent with wandering issues. The technology is there to do it, but you still have to have that conversation with the person, if at all possible, and think about the ethical issues and about that balance between safety and autonomy and privacy. But some of the technologies there are very unobtrusive kinds of tracking devices that can be used and connected to your smartphone, to a GPS app on your computer or what have you, that will tell you exactly where the person is and often even what they're doing. And they're little wafers that you can put into someone's shoe under the insole of the shoe, and watches that include a tracking device and those kinds of things. So it is absolutely possible to know where someone is at all times. The question is, does that person want someone to know where they are at all times? Other technologies, kind of in-home technologies, can monitor where someone is in the home and can alert you, for example, if there's a concern about the person's ability to use a stove, or the likelihood that they'll leave the stove on and create a fire hazard, or leave the tap on and flood the premises and those kinds of things. You can actually, many technologies are available now that can tell you what's going on in the room or in the home and where that person is, and if they've gotten up and made their cup of tea in the morning at the time that they usually do. So the possibilities are really, really great in terms of that kind of monitoring technology. You can set the technology, some of the tracking technology, you can set it with different geographic boundaries. So you can be, the caregiver could be alerted if the person leaves the house, if that's a concern, or if they leave the yard, if they're safe within their own yard, or the neighborhood, if they go further than the church, which is something that they do every day or on particular days. So the technological solutions for this particular issue of wandering are excellent, and getting better every day. But it still gives rise to that kind of ethical and privacy question about, do you really want someone tracking your every movement?
Mm-hmm. Wow, all great suggestions. So thank you both for sharing. I want to make sure we have enough time to get to a couple more questions coming. So we have a lady who's written in, and she said, how would you handle your loved one when she has given up on everything? In my situation, my mother ended up very ill and was hospitalized where she was in long-term care. She lost the use of her legs, so now she doesn't even want to try anything. She sleeps most of the day and is extremely cranky, lashing out at me saying I don't understand. The mood swings are very hard to deal with. Wow. Sounds like a very challenging situation. Sounds like maybe this woman is kind of not giving up, but just isn't happy with her situation and maybe taking it out on a caregiver, which can definitely be emotional. Janine, any suggestions or thoughts for this particular family caregiver?
I think that the first suggestion would be for that family caregiver to get resources for themselves as well, if there's a place for them, because of course, as he or she has said, the mood swings are hard to deal with, and if her or his mother is in a place where she is really difficult, that can tend to create less excitement about going to see her, less opportunities. It's easier to avoid it, and that social isolation isn't going to help. So I'd say the first step is for the daughter or son to look at what support could they get, and then I think I mean, you'd need a lot more information on this, but it would be also talking to the people in the facility, in the long-term care community. Is there something that they have, coming back to what Janet and I talked about around activities and stuff? Janet mentioned that for her dad, music was not interesting, but reading, talking about current events, those kinds of things were. So what was his mother interested in before? What brought her joy? What brought her happiness? Where did she feel she had expertise? Is there some way to start bringing some of that in and helping her to be able to be more engaged? And then she also may need to be seen by a physician. Perhaps there's even some way with medications, maybe it's depression, but finding out a little bit more about what's going on with her here.
Janine, that's a great suggestion. And there's one last great question that I want to just bring up really quickly. So I'm going to move on. I apologize. We just have a few minutes left of our hour-long webinar, but someone wrote in and asked, how can we help grandchildren relate to a grandparent who has dementia? And I wanted to ask Janet, my first instinct when I hear that, my first thought comes to technology. I mean, young people these days are very engaged in technology. Is there a tie-in between grandchildren and how they might relate to a grandparent with dementia through technology, or are there any other, or do you have any other thoughts on that? But Janet, I thought that might be a good question for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are things that are being worked on by computer scientists and engineers and occupational therapists and so on as well, who are inventing new technologies every day. And some of those have to do with engaging, as I said, social engagement, and including engaging with young people. And of course, as you say, young people now are very into social media and very adept with technologies, and their grandparents, especially those with dementia, may not be and may not have the capacity anymore. But it still can be engaging if there is someone, for example, who can help the person with dementia to access the technology. But one of my graduate students actually is working on a very interesting project where she's writing stories that are specifically intended for grandchildren to be, or for grandparents to be able to share with their grandchildren, and vice versa. And again, the digital storytelling technology also has that purpose in mind. So again, there are some solutions being developed. Not sure if they're on the market yet, but they're coming.
That's great to know. Thank you so much for sharing that. Janet. And I did have our organizer pull up the resource slide while Janet was talking, just so that you could see quickly some of the different resources that we've been mentioning. And again, any other resources that were brought up that we don't have listed here, we'll make sure we get out to you in the follow-up email. But helpforalzheimersfamilies.ca, missingseniorcarenetwork.ca, and then there's a great Facebook community. I know we've been talking a lot about technology and relating to other caregivers, past and present. That's a great community there that has gotten started where families are sharing their experiences. So you can always check that out. And then that wraps up our presentation today. I just wanted to thank everyone so much for joining in. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be available tomorrow on alzlearn.ca, and it will be also sent back to you via email. And then we also want to thank Janet and Janine so much for being with us, for sharing their expertise. I learned so much, and I hope that everyone on today's webinar also has learned a lot. So thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Lakelyn. This was a great chance.
And then there are additional opportunities, for you to participate in Alzheimer's Learning Day. You can, again, visit the website, and you can also share what you learned on social media with the hashtag ALZLearningDay2017. So you can share your favorite tidbit from today's webinar. You can also share the website, any other resources with family and friends that you think might benefit. So the whole Alzheimer's Learning Day was about learning, educating, and sharing. So we want to make sure that we're also sharing what we're learning. And again, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. And caregivers, be kind to yourself. You're doing a great job in the care you're providing to your loved one with Alzheimer's and dementia. So please keep up the good work, and I hope that all of the resources and information we shared today will help you on your caregiving journey. So with that, I will say good day, everyone, and have a great rest of the week. Take care. Bye.